Serious. Reddit, what's your most disturbing, scary, or creepy true story? Story 1. In 3rd grade, I had this strange short teacher named Mrs. Todd. She was always super nice to me in class. She'd always call on me to do the fun activities first, compliment me whenever I did something, and was generally just very positive toward me. At the time, I thought she was perhaps my favorite person in the world. I remember even telling my mother about how much I loved Mrs. Todd. Anyways, one day, I sat down at my desk and opened it up to put crap in it, when shockingly, I saw that there was a Victoria's Secret magazine sitting in the pull-out drawer. The kid sitting next to me noticed how shocked I was. I thought I was going to get in trouble, and we started talking about how it might have got there. Almost immediately, Mrs. Todd walks up, asks, "What have you got there?" I was seriously confused and told her it was sitting in my desk when I got here this morning. Well, she looks at me and tells me that the kid sitting next to me must have put it there. She kept repeating that statement over and over again, to both him and me, until I finally admitted that I guess he could have put it there. Maybe a few days after that, she approached me after class to tell me about this special field trip I could go on if I kept doing good in class. It would be a trip with just her and I to the Gulf of Mexico for the weekend. I remember being really excited about it at the time. However, suddenly, she got replaced at the school, and we got this new teacher that didn't like me as much. I was so heartbroken at the time. It wasn't until many years later that I realized how fucked up that situation was. It scares me thinking about it still. Story 2. When I was about 8 years old during recess at school, I noticed a bunch of other kids outside a storage room yelling and warning to others not to approach the door because there was an eyeball staring back at you. I was curious because I didn't understand what they meant, but I could see their fear was real because their faces were pale white, as they would try to deter me from taking a peek through the keyhole. I remember bending down slightly so I could get a closer look inside, and sure enough, there was an eyeball staring back at me, and it freaked me out so much I peed my pants on the spot. It was only later in the day, after I had ended up at the nurse's office because of the commotion us kids had created, that a janitor had to go into the room to inspect what this whole mess was about. Turns out that someone had placed a mirror against that door, and the eyeball we were seeing was our own reflection. Story 3. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6', she was 5'3", and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Story 4. Probably just my entire life would count as a disturbing, scary story. My mother and grandmother were always extremely protective over me as a child. I grew up forbidden to visit friends or family, walk down the street, go outdoors by myself, or even cook or drive. It got worse and worse as I grew older. I was 19, and my mother forbade me from having a job. She told me that I had everything that I needed right there with her. I didn't need money. I decided that enough was enough and saved up some money from doing laundry and finding change around the house, swiping what I could here and there, and I had to hide it well. She would steal it from me if she found it. She said that all money was hers and hers alone. I packed my bags one day and tried to leave. She actually tackled me to the ground and dragged me back inside with my grandmother's help, had my phone reported stolen, and took it from me so that I couldn't make calls, and slept beside my bed to make sure that I didn't sneak away. She took me to a church meeting one day, holiness, and had the demons blessed out of me for 3 hours solid. No one would help me. She had them all convinced that I was nuts and needed help. She even recruited a cousin on my next attempt weeks later, when I actually got a bus ticket, to come and trick me into the car. Cousin told me that she was protecting me, helping me, but she wanted to talk to me first. Shut the car door on me after I got in. It had a child safety lock on it. They drove me home and kept me isolated for a solid year before I could get help. Some of my relatives even parked their cars in the driveway for a while to keep me from leaving. We need the rest of the story. How did you finally get away? It was a combination of several things. I gained her trust back over time, get access to my phone again, and was able to get in contact with a guy that I knew, really nice guy, who I was strictly forbidden from talking to. He was the devil. Seriously, she called him multiple times and told him that he was a devil and needed to be rebuked. He promised to help me get out. This was hard, because she wouldn't even let me get an ID or anything, claiming that I'd use it to leave her. We couldn't contact the police. She once told them that she had papers somewhere that said that I was her custody and I was mentally insane, and they left me with her. Freaking Alabama. He, combined with a more trustworthy cousin, managed to help me save up some money in secret and sneak out to a waiting taxi one day in a grocery store. Guy and I flew to Idaho, where he had some family willing to help me, teach me how to drive and live on my own, and I haven't looked back since. Now I get daily calls, messages, and texts from my mother saying that I'm killing her and my grandmother, that they're dying without me. Funny thing is, I've seen pictures of her and she looks like she's lost half her body weight. She's a walking skeleton. Bonus, I found out later that she had access to nearly every single account that I've made online for anything and has been stalking me for years in secret, sometimes using my name. She's also tried multiple times since I left to get into my PayPal account, but it locks her out and sends me a message. Story 5. My cousin and his family, wife and infant son, had lived in their house for about 5 years. His wife left home to drop the baby off at daycare before work, but realized she had left her phone at home. Entering the house, she turned the corner to the hallway and nearly ran into the drop-down attic ladder, which was fully extended. They never used the attic as it was filled with loose insulation, and my cousin had left for work hours earlier. She quietly left the house, drove around the corner, and called the police. When the police investigated, they found a short-range transmitter connected to several cameras hidden throughout their home. The light fixture in the shower, the ceiling fan above their bed, even a pinhole in the nursery were sending videos to a nearby location. Their neighbor a few houses away had been given a key by the prior owners and installed surveillance equipment once he knew their schedule. My cousin's wife walked in on him updating his equipment, but he forgot something at his house and left to get it when she walked in. He had been watching them for years. Story 6. When I was a teenager, I was home alone one weekend, and I was sleeping in my parents' room since there was a TV in there. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at, from the direction of the hallway. I looked up, and I saw a shadow person looking at me. It was weird because it was a pure man-shaped black mass, and I could see him in the dark hallway. I'm guessing light from the TV helped. I sat up and stared back, but I was terrified. We looked at each other for probably 5 seconds, and then it turned and walked down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crash. I was so scared I turned the TV to the Disney Channel and stayed awake for as long as possible. When I woke up the next morning, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed a mirror that was hanging and fallen off the wall, and was shattered. My family still doesn't believe me, but I know what happened. Story 7. Years ago, I stayed for some nights at an hotel in the New Forest, which is a national park on the south coast of England. The hotel was a large former hunting lodge built sometime in the 19th century. I felt very uncomfortable in my room, and almost as though there were others there with me or someone watching me. I am not the kind of person that is normally given to such feelings, but they were very strong and extremely uncomfortable. I was with a large group staying there and speaking to others after the first night. Many felt the same. That first night it took me a long time to fall asleep, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I could not bring myself to turn out the lights before I went to bed. When I eventually fell asleep, I had the most vivid dreams that felt extremely real, of being in a trench somewhere during the Great War, and hearing the constant banging of explosions and of artillery pieces firing. I woke up feeling extremely distressed, and with a cold sweat. There was a banging noise, which I assume must have been some metal roofing not affixed properly moving in the wind. I've never felt anything like it since, and had never felt anything like it before. It felt so very real, and I was completely overwhelmed with so many emotions and utterly terrified. I couldn't get back to sleep. I felt like I was in the company of others. I felt like someone was near, or that feeling you get when you know people are looking at you. And I spent the rest of the night in a kind of daze. In the morning, I went downstairs for breakfast and saw a frame on the wall containing some photographs and a story about how the hotel was converted to a military hospital during World War I. I did not know anything about this before I arrived, and before that night. I had also not been reading anything about the war, or had seen anything on television recently about it. I'm a practical and skeptical woman, but I don't know what to make of that experience. I spent the remainder of the stay with one of my friends in another room. The oppressive atmosphere and general feeling of something wrong and frightening to me did not lift, and my friend I stayed with was also afraid and was glad of me to stay with them in their room.
Look behind you, Jacob.
Story 8. As a kid, I used to have awful nightmares every night, as well as the occasional night terrors. It had actually gotten so bad that I never slept more than 4 hours a night. I think it was thanks to a mixture of the sleep deprivation and general paranoia that I began seeing things out of the corner of my eyes, and usually there'd be nothing there when I took a double take. Once, though, while I was walking through a hallway in my house one night, I turned, and there actually was something there. It was tall and looked like a smoky, wispy silhouette, except for the yellow eyes, which looked very solid and bright in the low light. I've never felt that same level of dread as I did in that moment. I used to be religious, and I didn't know this until years later, but my church had actually told my father that something with yellow eyes was tormenting me. It made my skin crawl when he told me, because I never actually told him about it. At some point, it stopped, and I grew up and mostly forgot about it. A few months ago, I took my preteen sister to see a midnight showing of a horror film, and afterward, we began talking about our weird and creepy experiences and tried to rationally explain them. Mostly everything had some sort of logical cause, until she told me that when she was younger, she used to see shadow people out of the corner of her eyes. I laughed and told her it was funny because I had seen some too. It stopped being funny when she told me about how she was watching TV in our house during broad daylight while she had stayed home sick from school. She was home alone when she heard something down the hallway. She turned and saw a wispy, tall silhouette with shining yellow eyes. I had a rough time sleeping that night. Story 9. My best friend, her BF, and I went out camping in Sumter National Forest one night. It was raining, and we were the only campers out there. We decided to sleep in the SUV. I read a bit of scary stories to tell in the dark, until we decided to go to sleep. It was around midnight. The sound the rain was making outside sounded like footsteps. We were all pretty jumpy, and I was convinced I could hear someone outside. We turned on the headlights, and I saw something move in the trees to the right of the car. James got out and took a flashlight to go look, despite our protests. He made it about 20 yards into the woods, and then came sprinting back to the car. He screamed, "Go! Go! Go!" We booked it out of there, just in time to see a figure bursting out from the tree line. James said it looked like a man covered in filthy rags, but his face was all messed up. When James pointed the flashlight at him, the man looked up and started running at him. We ended up parking in a Piggly Wiggly parking lot for the rest of the night. Story 10. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He'd lead groups of tourists on horseback across mountain trails and such, and he met a lot of people during his time there. He met this Native American guy who started out as a regular customer and eventually became an employee. He came from an Indian reservation, although he never said which. He also didn't explain why he left. But he was a cool guy, so my dad never really gave his origins much thought. He always figured that he left for personal reasons and didn't want to be bothered about it, so my dad never brought it up. One day, my dad, his brother, and his Native American friend were out on the trail with a group of people. It was a pretty ordinary day. My dad and uncle told jokes back and forth, their friend laughing and jeering, and the tourists took pictures with their bulky cameras. Nothing unusual. As they were moving along, somebody shouted, "Coyote!" and pointed into a little valley on the left side of the field. Again, nothing strange. This was in the grassy chaparral of Central California, and coyotes are a very common sight. My dad and his companions stopped their horses so that their guests could have a look at the creature. My dad and his friend got to chatting, but my uncle kept staring at the coyote with his features all scrunched up, like he was trying to get a better look. My dad asked him what was up, and he said, "This coyote. It doesn't look healthy." The coyote had very long and thin legs, and it didn't walk normally. Most dogs walk by lifting a front leg and then lifting the opposite back leg, but this coyote walked by lifting both legs on one side of its body, sort of like a camel. Its snout was also a good 3 inches longer than normal, and it held its nose high into the air, as if it was sniffing for something. My dad said that it was probably just deformed, and my uncle agreed. Their friend, however, was silent. He was slightly shivering and staring directly at the weird coyote. My dad put his hand on his shoulder and asked, "What's wrong?" With a shaking finger, his friend pointed at the coyote and said, "The tail. Look at the tail." My dad looked and said, "What do you mean? It has no tail." The friend said that he'd explain everything when they got back to base camp, so my dad led the guests down the trail. The coyote followed them. It didn't come up from the valley, but it followed the group. The tourists thought it was fun to have a little companion, but my dad's friend never looked at it. He was silent the whole way back. When they were just a couple 100 yards from the base camp, the coyote leaped out of the underbrush, about 20 feet in front of my dad and his companions, freaking the fuck out of them and the horses. The coyote stared directly at my dad's friend and smiled. Not a panting smile like most dogs do, but a full-on teeth-bared smile, which showed off its yellow, brown-stained teeth. The friend stared back and produced a small piece of wood with an arrow burned into it. He showed its face to the coyote, which looked away. Then, the creature howled. Coyote howls are usually high-pitched, but this one was very low-pitched, almost baritone. It sounded like the thing had fluid in its lungs, as if it was drowning and able to make one final scream. Then it ran back into the bushes. My uncle, ever the jokester, turned to the stunned tourists and said, "Well, I hope you guys got your money's worth." At camp, my dad's friend wouldn't give them the whole story, only vague statements like, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." He said that he did this to protect my dad and uncle, because the less you know about it, the better. He gave them each a small piece of wood with an arrow on it, saying that it would protect them from the thing. He'd made them himself, he said, and he was glad that he got to test them out. He drove out at 8 and my dad never saw him again. My father always used to tell this story when I was younger, especially during camping trips. He's a high-spirited kind of guy, so he always tells it in good spirits. But sometimes he says that on cold nights, when the wind is blowing and there's a rustling in the trees, he can hear the low howl of the thing that wasn't a coyote. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like and subscribe. This is AskReddit Hub signing off.